He does not even know your name." The words came from Saraphene Korath's lips like silk dipped in venom, and they landed exactly where she intended them to land, square in the center of Alara Voss's chest. Alara stood very still in the corridor outside the main hall of the Citadel of the North, holding a tray of medical supplies she had been carrying for the last 10 minutes, searching for the soldiers' infirmary that no one had bothered to direct her toward. She had heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find 3 women blocking the narrow stone passage, all of them dressed in the kind of gowns that cost more than everything Alara owned combined. Saraphene stood at the center, her dark hair pinned with silver ornaments that caught the torchlight like tiny knives. She was beautiful the way winter was beautiful, all clean lines and terrible cold, and her eyes moved across Alara with the particular disinterest of someone examining an insect they were considering stepping on. "You are the servant from Ashvale, are you not?" Saraphene continued, taking one slow step forward. "The one without a wolf. I heard about you. Everyone has." She paused to let that sit. "Do you know what they say? They say the Ashvale delegation brought a human girl to the Great Convocation because they could not spare anyone of actual consequence." Alara said nothing. She had learned long ago that saying nothing in moments like these was the closest thing to armor she possessed. She kept her eyes level, her grip steady on the tray, and she breathed through the sting of those words, the way she had breathed through 1,000 stings before, slowly and without giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her flinch. Saraphene's companions made soft sounds of amusement, like birds calling to one another in a language designed to exclude. The corridor smelled of pine resin and cold stone, and the expensive perfume that surrounded Saraphene like a private weather system, something floral and sharp that felt entirely too large for the space it occupied. Alara thought about the soldier she had been sent to treat, a young man from her own delegation, who had twisted his ankle during the arrival ceremonies, and who was probably sitting somewhere in pain, waiting for her to figure out the layout of this massive fortress. She thought about him instead of the words still hanging in the air between her and Saraphene, because thinking about him was useful, and letting those words take root inside her was not. "You can go," Alara said finally, quietly, and turned to continue down the corridor. The sound that came from Saraphene was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sigh. It was something in between, something that managed to communicate both amusement and contempt simultaneously. "I want you to understand something," Saraphene said to Alara's back, and her voice had changed, dropped lower, become something more serious beneath the sweetness. "This convocation has a purpose. The next King of Wolves will be named before that moon rises full again, and the woman who stands beside him will shape the alliances that define the next generation of packs. That woman will be me. I have been working toward this for 4 years. I have arranged things. I have removed obstacles." She let that word hang deliberately. "I am telling you this not because you are a threat. You are not a threat. I am telling you because you are, for reasons I have not yet determined, already being noticed. By someone who should not be noticing anyone like you, and I find that inconvenient. So I am asking you, plainly and only once, to make yourself very small and very invisible for the remainder of this week, and then go home, and do not look back." Alara stopped walking. She did not turn around. She felt the words try to find purchase in her, try to locate the familiar architecture of her insecurity, and settle there the way birds settled on power lines, comfortable and automatic. She had spent 23 years being told versions of this same thing. Make yourself small. Be useful, and be quiet, and be grateful that you are tolerated. She knew the weight of those words, had worn them so long that sometimes she forgot they were external, forgot they had not always been part of her own internal voice. She stood in the cold corridor and breathed, and felt something move in the deep part of her. Not a response exactly. Not yet, but a slight and stubborn resistance, like a root finding a crack in stone. "I know where I am going now," Alara said at last, and walked forward, and did not look back at Saraphene Korath either. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The Citadel of the North was the oldest standing structure in the territory of the Northern Wolves, built 4 centuries ago by the first Storm King, Aldrich Stormvil, who had chosen the highest point of the Northern Ridge for his seat of power with the particular arrogance of someone who understood that geography was its own form of authority. The convocation was held here every generation, 40-odd years between each gathering, long enough that most of the wolves who attended had never seen one before, and would likely never see another. This made everything about the week feel both ancient and new, both sacred and terrifyingly consequential, and the whole citadel breathed with the particular tension of important things about to happen. Alara found the infirmary on the 3rd attempt, tucked into a low-ceilinged wing of the north corridor that smelled of dried herbs and something antiseptic that reminded her comfortingly of the healing rooms back at Ashvale, where she had spent most of her apprenticeship under Elder Maret. She treated young Piotr's ankle with practiced efficiency, wrapping it in the stabilizing bandage she had learned at 14, and applying the poultice of wolf bark and frost root that reduced swelling in shifter tissue 3 times faster than it would in a human. Piotr was 19 and embarrassed about his injury, and talked too much the way people did when they were nervous, asking her questions about the other delegations she had seen, about the Citadel, about whether she thought Alpha Kaden was as frightening as people said. More, Alara said honestly, because she had caught one glimpse of Kaden Stormvil at the arrival ceremony, and it had been enough to understand why. The songs about him existed. He was not frightening in the way that cruelty was frightening. He was frightening in the way that force of nature was frightening, something vast and impersonal, and utterly without interest in whether you found it comfortable. "Did you see how he stood?" Piotr asked, with the enthusiasm of someone who had been too far back in the crowd to see properly. "They say he has not smiled in 2 years. Not since the Eastern Border War. They say his wolf changed after that. Became something even he cannot fully control." Alara tied off the bandage and began cleaning her instruments. She had heard the stories. Everyone in the wolf territories had heard the stories about the storm wolf, about Kaden Stormvil's wolf spirit, that howled at alphas and betas and anyone it deemed a challenge, that had once sent a room full of pack leaders scrambling for the doors when its roar had pushed through Kaden's chest during a failed negotiation. The wolf was legendary for its aggression, its volatility, its refusal to be subdued by anything. Alara found herself wondering, as she often found herself wondering about things she had no practical reason to wonder about, what it felt like to carry something that powerful inside you. She had no wolf of her own to compare it to. She had nothing. She did not let herself linger on that thought. She had learned not to. The first full day of the convocation involved the presentation of delegations, a ceremony that was less a formal event and more a structured opportunity for every pack representative to be seen by every other in an environment where the social calculus was made deliberately complex by the mingling of alliances, rivalries, histories, and romantic prospects. The great hall had been transformed into something imposing and elegant. Stone walls hung with tapestries of pack crests, an enormous fireplace blazing beneath the mounted crest of the Stormvil line. Alara was not supposed to be in the hall at Ebury, all, her role being functional and marginal. But Elder Hawthorne had handed her a tray of appetizers at the last moment, because 2 servers had taken ill, and the optics of an Ashvale delegation with empty-handed staff were apparently worse than sending their healer out to carry food. Alara circulated. She had become very good at this particular skill, the art of moving through spaces where she did not belong without drawing attention to the fact of her presence there, finding the exact speed and posture that made her functionally invisible to the people around her. She carried the tray, and she listened and she observed, because observation was one of the things she had always done better than almost anything else. She learned, in the space of 40 minutes, that the Korath delegation was already in discussions with the Blackfen Pack about a post-convocation alliance, regardless of the outcome, which suggested either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary contingency planning on Saraphene's part. She learned that the youngest alpha present, a 20-year-old from the coastal Silvermarsh Pack, had been drinking since before the ceremony started. She learned that the Stormvil delegation itself moved through the room with the particular contained alertness of people who were managing something, watching exits and entrances with a systematic thoroughness that most of the other guests probably did not notice, but that Alara, who was doing something similar for completely different reasons, noticed immediately. She was near the far end of the hall when she became aware of a change in the room. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift in pressure, something in the atmospheric charge of the space that made the conversations around her drop by several degrees of volume almost simultaneously. She turned and saw Kaden Stormvil moving through the far entrance with 3 of his lieutenants behind him. She had seen him at the arrival ceremony, but there, she had been far back. And the ceremony had provided context, a frame, a structure within which to place him. Here, in the hall, among people, there was no frame. He simply existed in the space, and the space organized itself around him, the way water organized itself around stone, not because anyone consciously chose it, but because it was the natural physical response to something that occupied that much gravitational weight. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and he wore the black and silver of his pack with the total indifference of someone who had never needed clothing to communicate authority. His face had probably once been expressive and had learned to become a mask, every feature locked down to a baseline that gave nothing away. His eyes moved across the room in a single, unhurried sweep, the kind that missed nothing, and Alara, who had positioned herself at the edge of visibility, felt the sweep reach her and stop. She told herself later that she had imagined it. She told herself that the Stormwolf Alpha of the North had not had his scanning gaze arrest itself on the figure of an unremarkable girl carrying a tray of mushroom pastries near the east wall. She told herself this with great conviction, and then she looked up from where she had redirected her own gaze and found that he was still looking at her, not moving, not blinking, standing in the entrance to his own great hall with the stillness of something that had encountered an unexpected obstacle. Alara looked away. First, she looked away, because looking back felt like something she had not earned the right to do, and because there were several dozen pack representatives in that room who had far more claim on Kaden Stormvale's attention than she did, and because she was, she reminded herself firmly, here to carry a tray, not to make eye contact with the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. She moved toward the nearest cluster of guests and offered the pastries with the small competent smile she kept ready for exactly these situations. She did not look toward the entrance again. She did not need to. She could feel, with the part of her that had always been inexplicably sensitive to the invisible architecture of rooms, that something in the air had not quite gone back to normal. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The next morning, Alara woke before dawn in the small room she had been assigned at the edge of the servants' quarters. She had not slept well. Her mind had spent most of the night running over the events of the previous day with the obsessive persistence that she recognized as her nervous system processing something it had not known what to do with. She thought about Saraphene's words in the corridor the way you thought about a splinter, returning to the site of the discomfort, not because you wanted to, but because the body insisted on cataloging the location of its pain. Make yourself small. Be invisible. Go home. The words themselves were not new. She had heard versions of them her entire life. What was new was the specific reason Saraphene had given for delivering them, that Alara was being noticed by someone who should not be noticing her. She rose and dressed in the practical, unremarkable clothes that were as much a part of her invisibility strategy as her posture and her silence. She had an early task. Elder Hawthorne had requested she prepare a restorative tea for 3 members of the delegation, And the Citadel kitchens opened at first light. She made her way down through the still quiet corridors, navigating by the mental map she had begun building the moment she arrived. The kitchen corridor connected at its far end to the east courtyard, and she was passing that connection point when she heard it, a sound so unexpected that she stopped walking before her conscious mind had fully registered what had stopped her. It was the deep, rhythmic breathing of someone in the middle of extreme physical effort, and it was coming from the courtyard. She should have kept walking. Instead, she took 3 steps to the right and looked through the archway. Kaden Stormvil was there. He was training, alone, in the gray pre-dawn light, moving through what appeared to be a combat sequence, with the focused intensity of someone who did this, not for exercise but for something closer to necessity. He was shirtless despite the cold, which told her everything she needed to know about shifter thermal regulation, and he moved with a controlled, devastating efficiency that was genuinely difficult to look away from, each motion flowing into the next with a precision that did not look practiced, that looked simply intrinsic, as if this was just the way his body had always understood space and force. She watched for what was probably longer than 3 seconds and definitely shorter than a minute, long enough to observe that he was barefoot on the frozen stone, long enough to see the particular furrow between his brows that suggested this was not relaxation. It was something that functioned as a substitute for something else, some kind of internal management. He stopped. He stopped between one motion and the next with an abruptness that had nothing to do with finishing the sequence, and he turned his head toward the archway, and Alara understood in the fraction of a second before his eyes found hers that he had known she was there, had probably known the moment she stepped into range. Alpha senses were not something she had to speculate about. She had grown up among wolves, had watched them know things about their environment that should have been beyond human perception. She had simply, in the distraction of watching him, forgotten to remember what he was. His eyes found hers across the courtyard. Alara's internal voice, which had been composing a hasty and reasonable explanation for her presence in this corridor, went completely silent. She was aware of something in the air. Between them, something she did not have a word for, and was not sure she wanted one. A quality of attention that was not comfortable and was not uncomfortable. That simply was. Like temperature. Like pressure. Neither of them moved for a moment that stretched into something she could not have measured accurately. Then Kaden Stormvil said, "You are the healer from Ashvale." It was not a question. "Yes," Alara said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "I apologize for intruding. I was on my way to the kitchen." He looked at her for another moment, and she had the unsettling experience of being examined by someone whose examination was not hostile, but was absolutely thorough. The kind of assessment that left no part of its subject unconsidered. "The kitchen is the other direction," he said at last. "I know," Alara said. "I took the long way." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Something smaller and more ambiguous than a smile. He turned back to the center of the courtyard and resumed his sequence without another word. Alara stood in the archway for one more moment, heart doing something erratic that she firmly attributed to the early hour and the cold, and then she went to find the kitchen, which was indeed the other direction, and which she had known all along. She spent the rest of the morning in the delegation's rooms, preparing remedies and organizing her medical supplies, trying to arrange her thoughts into something useful. She was aware, in the specific way that she was always aware of information that felt important, even before she understood why, that the last 2 interactions she had experienced in this citadel were each significant in ways that she had not yet fully mapped. Saraphene's warning had implied something. Kaden's recognition of her as someone worth naming had implied something else. She was not naive enough to spin either of those implications into anything romantic or personal or meaningful in the way the tropes of old mate bond stories might suggest. She was too old for that kind of thinking, and too clear-eyed about her own position. She was a healer with no wolf, from a minor delegation, at the most politically charged gathering in a generation. Whatever was happening around her, she was certainly not the center of it. She repeated this to herself several times throughout the morning. It was almost completely convincing. The second night of the convocation brought the first formal competitive event, a series of ceremonial challenges between the alpha representatives that were ostensibly about tradition, but were functionally about establishing the dominance hierarchy before the actual selection ceremony. The great hall had been reconfigured, the tables pushed back, the central space cleared, torches blazing so that the room lived in the space between celebration and war. Ilara stood at the far edge of the Ashvale group and watched 3 rounds of challenges with the particular quality of attention. She gave to things she genuinely did not understand but wanted to, noting the ways different alphas compensated for different weaknesses, the way pack politics manifested in body language. By the time the 3rd round began, she had a fairly clear sense of the power distribution in the room. Kaden Stormvil had not competed in the first 2 rounds. She learned from the quiet conversation around her. The host pack traditionally observed rather than participated in the preliminary challenges, and Kaden would participate only in the final ceremony. She registered this and filed it, and tried not to think about where he was standing, relative to where she was standing, which she somehow knew with a precision that was easy to dismiss and difficult to actually dismiss. The 3rd round went wrong in a way that happened fast. The Silvermarsh Alpha, the young one Ilara had observed the previous night, had made it through both earlier rounds on what looked like determination alone but was not. Quite enough. In the 3rd round, a test of wolf control that involved managing a partial shift under pressure, something in him broke loose at the wrong moment. She saw it before anyone else did, probably, because she had been watching him specifically. The shift that came over him was not a controlled display. It was not the calculated demonstration that all the other alphas had produced. It was something that was fighting its way out of him, not at his invitation, not under his direction, and his face went through 3 rapid expressions that she recognized from years of working with injured and frightened wolves. Confusion, then fear, then the particular blankness of someone who has lost the negotiation with their own nature. She was moving before she consciously decided to move. This was not bravery. This was the body knowledge of a healer, the automatic recognition of a medical event in progress, the understanding that what was happening to the young Silvermarsh Alpha was a dissociative shift response, probably triggered by the accumulated stress of 2 days of performance anxiety, compounded by the previous night's alcohol, and that if someone did not break the feedback loop in the next few seconds, the outcome was going to be considerably worse for everyone present, including him. She pushed through the edge of the crowd, ignoring the sounds of alarm spreading around her, ignoring the specific hand that grabbed her arm and was shaken off, and crossed the cleared floor toward the young alpha. She reached him. She put her hand on his chest, flat-palmed, the way Elder Merritt had taught her. Not pressing but present, a point of contact that gave the body's nervous system something external to orient toward. She looked up at his face and kept her voice very low and very steady and said, "You are here. Your name is Danner. You are in the Citadel of the North. You are safe. Feel the floor under your feet." She had done this before. Not often, but enough to know that the words mattered less than the tone, that what the body heard in a moment of crisis was not content, but quality, and she kept hers absolutely level, absolutely warm, absolutely certain. "Feel the floor," she said again. "You are safe. Come back." The room was very quiet. She was aware of it in the way you were aware of a crowd holding its breath, a collective suspension that had weight and pressure. She did not break her focus to look around. She kept her eyes on Danner Silvermarsh's face, and her hand on his chest, and she said the words again, "Come back," in the same tone, and felt the moment the shift reversed, the particular quality of returning that she recognized in the way a change in weather was recognized. Something atmospheric and definitive. Danner blinked. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He exhaled, a long, shaking exhale, and took a step back. And the shift receded, and the room around them resumed breathing. Alara lowered her hand. She became aware, in the way she always became aware of context a few moments after a crisis had passed, that she was standing in the center of the challenge floor in front of every significant political figure in the Wolf territories, and that every single one of them was looking at her, including Kaden Stormvil, who had moved from his position at the side of the room to a point somewhat closer, and who was looking at her with an expression that she could not read at all, not because it was blank, but because it was too much of something specific to process quickly. She stepped back. She found the edge of the floor and stepped off it and made herself small again. And the moment broke, and the room began the process of recovering its normality. Attendants moving toward Danner, voices resuming, the specific diplomatic machinery of a large public gathering absorbing the disruption and covering it over. But before the moment fully broke, in the last second before she looked away, she caught the expression on Saraphene Korath's face across the room. It was the expression of someone whose very precise calculation has just had a variable introduced that was not in the original equation, and who does not yet know how to account for it. It was the expression of someone beginning to worry. Alara decided, walking back to the Ashvale delegation's position, that this was probably not a good sign for her specifically. She was right. The confrontation came the next morning, framed more carefully than the corridor encounter, more formally, more dangerously. Saraphene did not come alone this time. She brought 2 of her pack's senior beta females and a letter, and she found Alara in the healing room during the hour Alara had set aside for updating her medical notes, and she closed the door behind all 4 of them in a way that communicated something very specific about the nature of what was to follow. "I told you to make yourself invisible," Saraphene said. She was still beautiful, still composed, still wearing her emotions the way she wore her clothing, as a deliberate and artful construction rather than an honest expression. But there was something beneath the composure today that had not been there in the corridor, a tightness around her mouth, a quality of purpose that was sharper and less performative. She was not delivering a warning this time. She was delivering something else. Instead, you positioned yourself at the center of the most watched event of this convocation, and made yourself into a story that everyone will be telling by nightfall. "A young wolf was in medical distress," Alara said, and she heard in her own voice something steady that surprised her slightly. "I treated him. That is my function here." "Your function here is to carry bandages and stay out of the way," Saraphene said, and the sweetness was gone now. The silk was gone, and what was underneath it was harder and more honest, and in some ways more interesting. "Do you know what happened? After you walked away last night?" Kaden Stormvil crossed the floor, not to the Silvermarsh Alpha, to where you had been standing. He stood there for a moment, and then he went to his own quarter without speaking to anyone, which is apparently unprecedented behavior for a host during a convocation event. Do you know how many people noticed that? Do you know what they are saying about it? Alara said nothing. Her heart was doing the erratic thing again, and she was trying very hard to keep it from reaching her face. "They are saying," Saraphene continued, and her voice had dropped to something almost quiet, almost dangerous, "that the storm wolf went still when she entered the room the first night, that it has not made a sound since she arrived. His own wolves are frightened by it because they do not understand it, and what wolves do not understand, they talk about, and what they talk about becomes a story, and stories at a convocation become politics." She took a step closer. "I have 4 years invested in this outcome. I have alliances constructed, promises made, contingencies prepared. I will not allow an Omega servant with no wolf and no name to dismantle the architecture of my future because she managed to catch the attention of a man who does not know what to do with her." "I have not done anything," Alara said. "No," Saraphene agreed. "You have not, yet, which is why I am here before you do something. The letter I have brought is a formal request from the Korath. Delegation to the Ashvale Elder, requesting that you be relieved of your duties for the remainder of the convocation and confined to the servants' quarters, except for essential medical tasks. She placed the letter on the table between them, with a precision that was almost ceremonial. Elder Hawthorne is a practical man. He will not sacrifice a political relationship with the Korath pack over a healer who cannot even shift. I am giving you the courtesy of knowing what is coming so that you can prepare yourself. She left. Her beta females left behind her in their careful formation. The door closed. Alara sat for a moment with the letter on the table in front of her, looking at the Korath seal pressed into the wax, and she felt something that she might have described, if asked, as the moment before a storm, that particular quality of suspended anticipation when the air knows what is coming and the sky is not yet ready to confirm it. She thought about the young alpha on the challenge floor. She thought about Kaden Stormvil crossing the floor to where she had been standing, which she had not known until this moment, had not seen, and which she was now trying to process against the background noise of everything else she was trying to process simultaneously. She thought about the thing she had felt moving in herself in the corridor the first night, that root in the crack of stone. She picked up the letter and put it in her pocket. Then she picked up her medical notes and began writing again, because she had work to do. And work was the thing she had always been able to return to when everything else was uncertain. The solid ground of usefulness in the middle of whatever storm was building around her. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Elder Hawthorne summoned her that afternoon. He was a small, compact man in his late 60s, with the alertness of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating pack politics. And he looked at her with an expression that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic, regretful, and entirely pragmatic. "You understand the position," he said. "The Korath pack will be a significant force regardless of the convocation outcome. The optics of your continued presence at the central events are drawing attention we cannot afford." He paused. "You have done nothing wrong, but I would ask you to remain in the servants' quarters for the next 2 days and attend your duties there. The final ceremony will require your attendance as part of the delegation. That cannot be avoided. I am sorry, Alara. This is politics, not judgment." "I know," she said. And she did. She returned to her room and sat on the narrow bed in the early afternoon light. And for a moment she simply let herself feel it. The particular cold of being moved from the board, as if she were a piece that had been played out of turn. The particular weight of someone else deciding, again, what her presence was worth, and where it was appropriate for her to exist. She let herself feel it, because she had learned that not feeling it did not make it smaller, just slower and more corrosive. She felt it fully, and then she breathed, and she thought about what to do next, because feeling things was one thing, and being ruled by them was another. She was still sitting there, thinking, when someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find a young man she did not recognize, dressed in the black and silver livery of the Stormvil pack, who told her that the Alpha of the North requested her presence in his study at her earliest convenience. He said it with the careful, neutral tone of someone delivering a message they had been told to deliver neutrally, regardless of the response it generated. Alara looked at him for a moment. "Tell him I will come," she said. She had a very particular conversation with herself during the walk to Kaden Stormvil's study, and it went something like this. "Whatever this is, it is not what it feels like. Whatever this is, it is probably political, probably related to the incident with Danner Silvermarsh, probably about the Ashvale delegation's medical competency, or lack thereof, or some other practical matter that she had a clear and reasonable role in discussing. It was absolutely not, anything else." She arrived at the study door, knocked, entered when she was told to enter, and found Kaden Stormvil standing at the window of a room that was large and book-lined and smelled of cedar and ink, looking out at the gray afternoon sky over his territory with his hands clasped behind his back. And she was immediately struck by the understanding that she had not adequately prepared herself for the specific quality of being alone in a room with him. He turned when she entered. His eyes found her with the same arresting directness they always seemed to find her, and she felt again that peculiar arrested quality in the atmosphere between them, that stillness that was not absence of feeling but was the opposite of it, was too much of something to be easily characterized. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. She sat in the chair that faced his desk. He remained standing, which she noted as a deliberate choice. He was someone who understood the language of physical space and was always choosing his position within it with intention. "You treated Danner Silvermarsh last night," he said. "Yes," she said. "You crossed the floor in front of every delegation present," he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact that he was examining. "He was in medical distress," she said. "I did not have time to consider the optics." "No," Kaden said, and something in his voice shifted, something warmer underneath the precision. "You did not. You acted on instinct without calculation, in a situation where every other person in that room was calculating whether the risk of involvement was worth the political cost." He paused. The answer most of them reached was no. He looked at her steadily. "Your answer was different. My answer is always going to be to help the person who needs help," Ilara said. "That is not heroism. It is just who I am." The silence that followed that statement had a texture she could not quite identify. Kaden looked at her, and she had the particular experience of being seen, not observed, not assessed, not catalogued, but actually seen, which was different from all of those things and rarer than any of them. "I have been told," he said at last carefully, "that the Ashvale Elder has restricted your movements for the remainder of the convocation, at the request of the Korath delegation." She had not expected him to know that. The speed of the information in this citadel was, she supposed, something she should have anticipated. "Yes," she said. "I have also been told," he continued, with the same careful precision, "the reason that request was made." He turned slightly, looking back at the window for a moment, and she saw in the line of his shoulders something that she recognized, not because she had seen it in him before, but because she had felt it in herself. A person managing something difficult, with a great deal of controlled effort. "My wolf," he said, and stopped. He began again. "My wolf has not been still in 4 years. Not during negotiations, not during battle, not during any formal event of any kind. It has been a source of significant difficulty for my pack and for my own management of authority, because a wolf that cannot be stilled is perceived as unstable, and an alpha who is perceived as unstable cannot function effectively in the political role this convocation is designed to fill." He paused. "The night you arrived in this citadel, it went silent. I do not know what to do with that information, but I thought you should have it." Ilara sat very still. Something was happening inside her that she did not know the word for, something large and slow-moving. An inevitable feeling, like weather. "I do not have a wolf," she said. "I have never shifted. I do not know why yours would respond to me in any way." "Neither do I," Kaden said. "But it does." He looked back at her. "I'm going to speak to Elder Hawthorne about your restrictions. I would like you to be present at the remaining events as part of the Citadel's medical staff, which is within my authority to arrange without consulting the Korath delegation. That is a practical solution that does not require either of us to explain anything to anyone." He held her gaze. "Is that acceptable to you?" She should have said yes immediately. Instead, she sat with the weight of everything he had just said. And she said, "Why do you want me there?" It was a very direct question, possibly too direct given every aspect of the power differential between them. The fact that she was a healer with no wolf from a minor delegation, and he was the alpha of the North. She watched his face respond with the quality of someone who had not expected directness and was not sure whether to be annoyed by it or something else. "Because," he said at last, and his voice was lower and more careful, and absolutely honest in a way she had not heard from him before. "Something settles when you are in the room, and I function better when something settles, and I have not been able to function at the level this convocation requires for 4 years, and I would like very much to function now." He paused. "That is an honest answer." "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him and felt the root in the crack of stone again, that stubborn and surprising upward pressure. "Tell Elder Hawthorne whatever you need to tell him," she said. "I will be there." The next 3 days unfolded in the particular way of things that are both ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, each hour containing within it both the normal mechanics of the convocation proceedings and something underneath those mechanics that was building toward a shape neither of them was naming. Ilara attended the formal events as part of the Citadel's medical staff, which gave her a standing and a position that was adjacent to but separate from the political machinery of delegation and alliance and candidacy. She moved through the events with her characteristic efficiency, doing the actual work of her function, while the larger drama of the convocation proceeded around her, treating the minor injuries and stress responses and overconsumption aftermaths that were the invisible backstage of any major gathering of shifters. Kaden was present at most of the same events. This was not remarkable. As host, his presence was expected and required, but she became aware, through accumulated observation rather than single revelation, that his presence at any given event included a specific calibration of spatial awareness that consistently oriented him in a way that meant he always knew where she was in any room they occupied. Together. She tested this theory by repositioning herself at several different points during 2 different events, and both times, without any apparent adjustment in his attention, his body orientation shifted fractionally to account for the change. Saraphene noticed. Of course, Saraphene noticed. Ilara could see, across rooms, the calculations happening behind Saraphene's composed face, the rapid processing of information, the construction and revision of strategy. She watched Saraphene escalate. Her campaign for Kaden's formal attention, arranging herself at his side during public moments, engineering visible proximity that would be read politically as progress regardless of whether it had any personal substance behind it. Kaden was unfailingly courteous to her, but Ilara, watching from her position at the edge of events, could see that courtesy was all it was. She did not let herself draw conclusions from this. On the 4th night, something happened that bypassed all her rules about conclusions. She was returning to the servants' quarters from the healing room very late, having stayed to prepare for the following day's work, and she took the route through the west corridor, because the east corridor was being used for a late diplomatic meeting that she had no desire to walk through. The west corridor was quiet and cold, and only partially lit. The torches on this end of the citadel banked low for the night, and she was halfway through it when she heard footsteps behind her. That were not the footsteps of a servant going about their duties. They were heavier, more deliberate, moving at a pace that was not quite catching up, but not quite staying back. And she felt the particular crawl along her skin that she had always associated with situations that were not what they should be. She turned, because she had learned that the worst thing you could do when something felt wrong was to pretend it did not. 3 members of what she recognized, from the colors of their clothing, as the Korath Pack's 2nd-tier delegation stood in the corridor behind her. They were all young men, all large, all carrying the particular quality of people who had been given a task they believed was sanctioned by someone more powerful than themselves. None of them said anything. They did not need to. The message was communicated entirely in the positioning, in the fact of them being there in a corridor she was in, at a time when no one else was around. Ilara held her medical bag in both hands and considered her options, which were limited but not nothing, and she was still in the middle of considering them when the air in the corridor changed. She had not heard him arrive. She genuinely had not. She became aware of Kaden Stormvil's presence in the corridor behind the 3 Korath wolves only because the 3 Korath wolves became aware of it first, and their awareness was communicated through their bodies in the specific way that wolves communicated the presence of a superior predator, a collective and involuntary shift in posture, a drawing back, a reorganization of their physical space to accommodate something that had entered it that they had not invited and could not argue with. She turned slowly, because she wanted to see. Kaden stood perhaps 10 feet behind them, and his face was the composed mask she had seen in public. But his eyes were something else entirely, and the air around him had a quality that she now recognized, the particular atmospheric density that preceded his wolf making itself felt through him. "You are in the wrong corridor," Kaden said to the 3 men. His voice was entirely conversational. It was the conversational tone of someone who did not need to raise their voice to be understood. The 3 men looked at each other, and then at the exit at the far end of the corridor. "Go," he said, in the same tone. They went. The sound of their footsteps retreated rapidly, and then the corridor was quiet and cold again, and it was only her and Kaden in the torchlight. She let out the breath she had been holding. "Thank you," she said. He crossed the corridor to her in several strides, and she looked up at him, because he was considerably taller, and found an expression on his face that was the least masked thing she had seen from him. Something that was partially anger, and partially something else. Something that sat in the territory between relief and recognition. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "They had not actually done anything. I think they were intended to frighten me." She paused. "It worked, for the record." Something crossed his face that was very close to something she might have called a smile if she were more confident in her ability to read him. "You do not seem frightened," he said. "I am very good at not seeming things," she said, and meant it. He looked at her with that quality of full attention that she had stopped trying to interpret, and had started simply accepting as the thing it was. And then he said quietly, "Come with me." It was not a command. It was something gentler than a command, a request with the weight of necessity behind it. She followed him, because she had already decided, somewhere in the last 4 days, that she would follow him when he asked her to. Not because of authority, but because of something she was still being very careful not to name. He brought her to the east wing of the citadel, to a smaller courtyard. She had not found in her explorations, walled on 3 sides by old stone, and open on the 4th to a view of the northern sky that was breathtaking even in the cold, stars visible between moving clouds, the kind of dark that only existed far from cities and settlements where light pollution had not yet reached. He stopped at the courtyard's center, and she stopped beside him, and they stood together in the cold and looked at the sky, and the silence between them was not the silence of absence, but the silence of 2 people who had said enough and were now simply being in the same space, which was its own kind of communication. "My wolf," he said eventually, "has been silent for 4 days." He paused. 4 days is the longest it has been quiet since I was 17 years old and first shifted, and it and I reached our original understanding. He looked down at her. "I do not know what you are to it. I do not know what you are to me. But I know that 4 days of quiet has allowed me to remember what it feels like to think clearly, and I am not willing to go back to the noise." Alara turned to look at him. Her heart was doing things that she had given up trying to regulate. "I am a healer, with no wolf," she said, "from a minor delegation, at a convocation where the selection of a king of wolves is happening in 2 days." "I know," he said. "The politics of this," she said carefully, "are not small." "No," he agreed. "They are not. Saraphene Korath has been building toward this for 4 years," she said. "She has alliances and arrangements, and she is not someone who accepts interference quietly. You have already seen evidence of that tonight." Yes, he said. Then you understand, she said, why I am trying very hard to be honest with both of us about what this is and what it cannot be. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with a care that she recognized as the care of someone choosing their words with specific intentionality, he said, What if I told you that my wolf, which has never in its existence recognized a mate bond, has been doing something since you walked into this citadel that I can only describe as recognizing, and that I am the alpha of the North, and I understand the politics, and I am telling you that I have never in my life made a decision based on anything other than what I believed was right, and that right now, everything I have is telling me that you are the piece of this that I have not known I was missing. The sky above. Them was doing something extraordinary, the clouds moving in a way that briefly revealed a wide sweep of stars, and the cold was very real, and Alara stood in it and felt the root press upward through stone. And she thought about 23 years of making herself small, and the corridor on the first night, and the young wolf on the challenge floor, and the word that Kaden had used, recognizing, which was the word that sat at the center of every old story about mate bonds, the word that the stories used to describe the moment when everything else became secondary to one single, impossible, undeniable truth. She was about to say something careful and measured when something happened inside her that had never happened before. It started in her sternum, the hollow place where she had always felt the absence of a wolf most keenly, and it spread outward through her chest and down her arms and up into her throat, and it was warm, genuinely warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, not the absence she had spent 23 years learning to live inside, but a presence, small and new and extraordinary, like a sound she had not known she had been listening for finally arriving. She pressed her hand to her chest. Her voice, when she found it, was barely above a whisper. Something is happening, she said. Kaden was very still. He was watching her with an expression that she would have described, if she had been forced to find words for it, as someone watching a thing they had believed impossible becoming possible in real time. Yes, he said. I can feel it. I do not have a wolf, she said. But even as she said it, she knew it was no longer quite accurate. Knew it the way you knew, when a part of you that had been asleep was beginning, slowly and with great effort, to wake. You do, he said. It has been sleeping for a very long time. He reached out, slowly enough that she had time to step back if she wanted to, and put his hand over hers where she had pressed it to her chest. The warmth intensified. My wolf knew before I did, he said. That is why it went quiet. It was waiting. She looked at him in the cold starlight, and felt 23 years of smallness trying to reassert itself against something new and large and insistent. Felt the old arguments marshalling themselves. The list of reasons this was impossible. The catalogue of her inadequacies. The familiar and well-worn path toward making herself less than she was so that the world would be comfortable with her. She felt all of it. And then she felt the thing in her chest push back against all of it with a quiet, stubborn, animal certainty. And she thought, enough. I am not small, she said, out loud, to the air and the stars and the man standing beside her. I have spent my whole life being told I am, and I have spent my whole life more or less believing it, and I do not believe it anymore. Kaden looked at her with eyes that were warm in a way she had not seen from him before, the warmth of someone who has been cold for a long time and recognizes what warmth feels like when it returns. No, he said. You are not small. You are exactly the opposite. She leaned into him. Not all the way. Not with the abandon of a story that had already resolved itself, but with the tentative trust of something beginning. And he stood steady against her lean. And they remained like that in the cold courtyard under the moving sky, while something ancient and sleeping and long ignored stirred to life in the place where she had always known, even when she would not admit it to herself, that something was supposed to be. The morning of the final ceremony arrived with the particular quality of mornings that understand their own significance. Alara woke before the bell, lay for a moment feeling the new warmth in her chest that had not faded through the night, and understood that the next several hours would determine the shape of everything that came after. She dressed carefully, not in her usual gray anonymity, but in the deep blue that Elder Mared had given her years ago for the occasions that required more than function. The garment that she had always thought of as too significant for herself, and had rarely found the courage to actually wear. She wore it now. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the basin, and she recognized, with a quality of recognition that felt genuinely new, the person looking back. The final ceremony of the Great Convocation was held in the main courtyard of the citadel, under open sky, because some traditions required witness from above as well as below, and the wolves who had established this ceremony 4 centuries ago had understood that. The entire convocation gathered, every delegation arranged in the semicircle around the central stone, the ancient marking stone of the Stormvil line that bore the pack's history in layers of carved names and dates and events going back to the first storm. King. The sky was overcast, cold and gray, and indeterminate. The kind of sky that might deliver sun or snow with equal likelihood. Ilara stood with the Ashvale delegation in their position in the semicircle, and felt, with extraordinary clarity, every single person in the gathering who was aware of her presence, which was considerably more people than would have been true a week ago. Saraphene Korath stood across the semicircle in the Korath position, and she was watching Ilara with an expression that had finally dropped the performative warmth and was simply what it was underneath. The face of someone who understood they were in a different game than the one they had prepared for, and who was deciding in real time how to respond. She was still composed. She would always be composed. It was structural for her, not situational. But beneath the composure was something that Ilara recognized as the particular texture of someone confronting the limits of their own planning. The place where contingency architecture runs out, and what remains is simply the unmanageable reality of things not being what you calculated they would be. The ceremony began. An elder of the neutral Clearwater pack presided, reading the traditional words in the old tongue that Ilara had studied but had not expected to hear, delivered with this much resonance, the language of founding and continuity, and the ongoing negotiation between individual will and collective responsibility. Each Alpha delegation presented their formal endorsement or non-endorsement of candidacy through the traditional responses. Then came the moment that the entire convocation had been built toward, the moment that the ceremony's language called the sounding. The presiding elder would ask the storm wolf of the north to make himself known before the gathered packs, and what happened next would either confirm or deny the readiness of the candidate. The ceremony language for the sounding was specific and formal. The elder would call upon the wolf, and the wolf would respond, and the nature of the response would tell the assembled packs whether the candidate's wolf was steady enough for the burden of kingship. A wolf that howled uncontrolled, or refused to answer, had historically disqualified candidates. What was needed was a wolf that answered clearly and steadily, demonstrating the controlled power of a beast that worked with its alpha, rather than against him. Kaden stood at the center of the semicircle before the stone. He was in the formal black and silver of his pack's ceremonial dress, and he stood with that quality of contained force that she had come to know, that deep stillness around which everything else organized. The elder asked the question in the old tongue. Ilara, standing in her position in the delegation's formation, felt the gathering hold its breath, felt the weight of 4 years of Saraphene's planning in the air, felt the weight of 2 days of something beginning. Between her and Kaden, pressing against the weight of the political architecture of the world they were both standing in. Felt, in her chest, the small new warmth moving. Kaden closed his eyes. A moment passed. The silence was complete, the kind of complete that was itself a sound. And then his wolf answered. It was not a howl. She did not know how to describe what it was exactly. because she had never felt anything like it before, and had no framework for it. It was a sound that was also a feeling, a resonance that moved through the gathered wolves and through her, and through the air of the courtyard, and through the stone under their feet, deep and clear and steady and enormous. Not the volatile aggression of the storm wolf in its difficult years, but something that had the same power and a completely different quality. Something that was, she understood with the whole of herself in the moment she felt it. At peace. At rest. A wolf that had found its still point after 4 years of searching for it, that was answering the elder's call from that still point with all of its considerable power and none of its unchanneled volatility. The elder was silent for a long moment. Then he said, in the common tongue so that everyone could understand, "The storm wolf answers clearly. The candidate is confirmed." The sound that went through the gathering was complex, many threads at once, the sound of a political outcome being accepted by people who had prepared for different possibilities and were adjusting their preparation in real time. Ilara heard it all from inside a particular quality of stillness that she recognized as the outer edge of something significant, the place right before things change so completely that the before and after become 2 different worlds. She felt Saraphene look at her across the semicircle, and she met that gaze steadily, without flinching, and held it for the duration of a breath before she looked away again, not in defeat, but in something closer to acknowledgement, the recognition of 2 people who had been playing a game, and one of whom was choosing to step out of it. The ceremony continued through its final stages, the formal recognition, the traditional responses from each delegation, the recording of the outcome in the convocation's official record. Ilara stood through all of it, feeling the warmth in her chest, feeling the gathered wolves around her, feeling the particular and unusual experience of knowing that things were about to be different in ways she had not had time to fully map. When the final words were said, and the gathering began to dissolve into the organized movement of people with places to go and things to respond to, she stayed where she was for a moment, breathing. She heard him before she saw him, which was not how she had expected to hear him at all, in the ceremony context, the formal resolution of a formal event. But she heard him say her name, just her name, Ilara, from behind. Her, and she turned. Kaden was there, and the 3 senior members of his inner circle were behind him at a respectful distance, and most of the remaining gathered wolves were watching, because the Alpha of the North was crossing the formal space of the convocation's closing to stand in front of one particular person, and that was a statement that did not require translation into any tongue, old or common. He stood before her, and he was still in his ceremonial dress, and he looked at her with eyes that were entirely open in a way she had not seen from him before this moment, the mask entirely gone, nothing between what he felt and what he showed, and she found that it was a considerable amount of something. "I would like," he said, with the careful precision of someone who understands that words are binding, "to formally present you to this gathering as the one my wolf has chosen." He paused. "I am aware that this is not something either of us planned. I am aware of the political complexity it introduces. I am aware that you have had approximately 4 days to process what would normally take considerably longer. I am asking you anyway, because I have spent 4 years learning what it costs to deny what is true, and I do not want to add to that cost." The gathering around them was very quiet. Ilara felt every eye in the courtyard as a kind of pressure that she noted and then deliberately set aside, because the pressure of other people's attention had shaped her choices. For 23 years, and she had made a decision, sometime in the cold courtyard under the stars the previous night, to stop letting it. She looked at Kaden Stormvil, the Alpha of the North, newly confirmed King of Wolves, and she felt the thing in her chest that was still new, and still learning how to exist in a body that had not known it before. And she thought about the root in the crack of stone. "I am a healer, with no formal pack standing," she said, clearly enough that the nearest members of the gathering could hear her. who grew up on the margins of a world that told me I did not fully belong to it, and I spent a long time believing that was the truth of me. She paused. It was not the truth. The truth is that I have been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for the thing that would remind me what I actually am. She looked at him. And I accept. Something moved through the gathered wolves that was not quite sound and not quite movement, but was both at once, the kind of collective response that only happened when something significant enough to matter to everyone present had just occurred. Ilara heard it as if from a slight distance, because most of her attention was on the expression on Kaden's face, which was the expression of a man for whom something long delayed had just arrived, and which was, she understood, also a mirror of what was on her own face at the same moment. He reached out and took her hand, the formal gesture of the acknowledgement, the gesture that would appear in the convocation record, that would be witnessed by every delegation present, that would send riders with news to every pack in the Northern Territories before nightfall. He took her hand, and she felt the warmth in her chest respond to his touch with an intensity that was still surprising, still new, still learning its own dimensions. She looked up at him in the gray sky and the cold air in front of everyone they would now spend their lives navigating together, and she thought that this, all of this, the presence inside her and the hand around hers, and the impossible, ordinary, extraordinary fact of being seen and chosen, was worth every moment of the long waiting. Saraphene Korath left the convocation gathering before the formal closing reception. Ilara heard this later from Elder Hawthorne, who delivered the news with the tone of someone who had revised several of his calculations about the political landscape and was still in the process of catching up with the implications. The Korath delegation departed the citadel by the following morning, efficiently and without incident, leaving behind only the letter that Saraphene had placed in Ilara's hand in the healing room, which had never been delivered to Elder Hawthorne, and which now sat in Ilara's pocket as a kind of reminder, not of the threat it had been intended as, but of the thing she had chosen in the face of it. The remaining days of the convocation's formal proceedings were a different experience than the first 5 had been. Ilara moved through them not in the margins but at the center, not as the thing that was being managed around, but as the person that things were being arranged in relation to. It was disorienting in the specific way that radical change in status was always disorienting. She made mistakes of protocol, which Kaden's inner circle corrected with patience and without condescension. She asked questions that were probably too direct for the formal context, which Kaden answered without apparent difficulty. She learned that she would need to learn a great many things, and she discovered that she had no fear of this. There was one moment, on the final morning before the delegations departed, that she would return to for a long time afterward. She was in the small courtyard, the one with the view of the northern sky, standing in the early morning light with her hand pressed flat against the old stone of the wall, when she felt the thing in her chest stir in, a way that was unmistakably becoming something more definite. She pressed her hand harder against the stone and breathed and felt it, the wolf that had been sleeping in her, moving in the interior space of her with a tentative and extraordinary newness, like something testing its own existence for the first time. It was not a full shift. It would not be for a while yet, but it was there, genuinely there, and she felt it the way you felt the sun after a very long winter, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation, the arrival of something you had kept a small, stubborn belief in, even when the evidence had suggested you were foolish to believe. She heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Kaden there, in the informal dress he wore when the convocation ceremonies were not in session, his expression open in the way it had become open since the ceremony, since the moment he had stopped managing himself so tightly and allowed the world to see some of what was inside him. He stopped beside her at the wall and looked at her hand pressed against the stone, and then at her face, reading her the way he had always read her, that thorough and undefensive attention that she had come to recognize as his specific form of care. "It is moving," she told him. I know, he said. I can feel it. He had told her that the mate bond worked this way, that once it was acknowledged, it became a form of shared sensing, not invasive, not complete, but present, a thread of awareness between two people, who had become something to each other, that the old language called partners of the spirit. He looked at her with warmth, and with something that had the patience of a person who understood waiting because he had done it himself, who had been waiting for 4 years in his own particular way, through his own particular kind of noise. It will take the time it takes, he said. I know, she said. And then, because she was who she was, because honesty was one of the things she had promised herself, she would not sacrifice in this new part of her life even when the old habits of smallness tried to reclaim her. She said, I am a little frightened, of all of it, of this. She gestured, meaning the wolf, the bond, the position, the future, the enormous quantity of change that was compressed into the last week and was now unfolding into the next decade. I want you to know that, because I have spent a very long time pretending not to be frightened of things that frightened me, and I am choosing to stop doing that. He put his arm around her shoulders, a gesture that was both more natural and more significant than she had expected. The ease of it, the way it required no negotiation. I know, he said. I am also a little frightened. Of all of it. He paused. Of you, specifically. She laughed, which startled her. The sound of it in the morning air, genuine and unguarded. Of me, she repeated. You crossed the challenge floor without hesitation for a wolf you had never met, he said, with the tone of someone making a case. You said no to Saraphene Korath, quietly, twice, when saying no to Saraphene Korath is something that half the alphas in the Confederation have never managed. You looked at me, the first morning in the courtyard, and did not look away first. He looked at her sidelong. You are, it turns out, one of the most unfrightening and also frightening people I have ever encountered. That is a very strange compliment, she said. I am a very strange person, he said. She leaned into him, and he was steady against her lean, and they stood together, looking out at the northern sky, beginning to lighten at the edges. Not quite dawn yet, but its precursor, the first hint that the dark was not permanent, that what had been quiet was going to be luminous. The wolf in her chest moved again, stronger this time, with the gathering confidence of something finding its footing, and she felt Kaden's awareness of it through the thread between them, his wolf, meeting hers across whatever interior landscape the bond created. And the meeting was quiet and certain and vast and warm. She was not. She understood finally and completely, and without the old arguing voice trying to reframe it. Small. She had never been small. She had been unseen, which was a completely different thing. And the difference between those two states was the difference between what was true of you and what the world had been allowed to know. What the world now knew. What the gathered packs had witnessed, and the convocation records would formalize, and the stories that were already beginning would carry outward to every territory in the northern lands, was this, that the storm wolf had gone still for the first time in 4 years, when a girl without a pack and without a wolf, and without any of the credentials the world had decided were necessary, walked into a room and simply was herself. That the wolf that had howled at every alpha had chosen, with the absolute animal. Certainty of a nature that did not know how to be diplomatic about truth, the one that all the diplomacy in the world had been arranged to overlook. That the overlooked girl had a wolf, after all, had always had one, had carried it sleeping inside her through all the years of being told she did not belong, and that the wolf, when it finally woke, was going to be extraordinary. The stories would say many things over the years. They would say that the Great Convocation produced the first Storm King. In 4 centuries, whose rule was characterized not by the force of his wolf, but by the partnership of his bond. They would say that the Queen of the North was a healer. They would say that her wolf, when it finally emerged, was unlike any wolf the pack healers had ever documented, ancient in its signature, carrying bloodlines that the genealogical records had thought lost, that its emergence retroactively explained why a girl from a minor delegation with no apparent supernatural gifts had walked through a world of wolves her entire life, and managed, somehow, to be more than fine, to be exactly what the world had needed and had not known to ask for. But those were stories for later. In the morning light of the last day of the convocation, on the wall of the small courtyard that looked out over the northern sky, two people stood in the beginning of what they were building, and felt it settle around them like weather that had finally, after a long time traveling, reached the place it was meant to be. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?